In the dead of winter, as snow claws across the abandoned roads of Iron Vale, Montana, a 4-year-old girl stands alone by a frozen lake. Her pink dress is torn, her cheeks streaked with dirt and tears. She doesn't speak. She just points to the ice. A passing truck screeches to a halt. Inside, a German Shepherd K9 growls low, eyes locked on the child. His partner, a soldier shattered by war and haunted by loss, steps out, reluctantly. He thinks he's about to save a child, but what he finds beneath the ice, it might just save him. Before we begin, you're in his boots now. Would you walk away or dig through the ice? Let us know in the comments. The snow had begun falling at noon, but by late afternoon it had become a blizzard. The pine trees stood frozen like silent guards, their limbs heavy with white. Wind howled down the abandoned highway, battering the windows of a rusted pickup crawling along the snow-covered road. Inside the truck, Caleb Mercer squinted through the windshield, jaw tight. He was 40, with a soldier's build softened slightly by years of silence and solitude. His face was lean and weather-worn, marked by a faint scar above his right brow and a week's worth of stubble peppered with gray. His dark brown hair was clipped short, military style, more out of habit than upkeep. The sleeves of his forest green t-shirt clung to his arms, revealing old tattoos that told stories he never spoke of. His eyes, pale steel blue, rarely blinked when fixed on the road, until now. Beside him sat Bruno, a 6-year-old German Shepherd with a black saddle coat and alert amber eyes. Unlike most dogs, Bruno didn't pant or whimper during storms. He sat rigid, his posture proud and trained. But that afternoon, something in him changed. His ears flattened, his head tilted. He let out a low, guttural growl. "What is it?" Caleb muttered, glancing sideways. Bruno rose suddenly, paws pressing against the dashboard, growl growing into a snarl. That was unusual. In all the years since their final mission together, since Afghanistan, since the ambush that cost them 5 men and a part of Caleb's soul, Bruno had never reacted this way. Caleb's pulse quickened. He gripped the wheel tighter, eyes scanning the blur outside. Then he saw her. Just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the storm, stood a small figure, a child, a girl, no more than 4. She stood alone at the edge of the frozen lake, her little arms stiff at her sides, one finger pointing straight out toward the center of the ice. She wasn't moving. Her blonde hair, tangled and plastered to her face by ice and wind, whipped around as she shivered in place. Her dress, a pale pink thing, once delicate, was torn and soaked through. Mud streaked her legs. Her face was dirty, red, raw with windburn, and something else, maybe tears. Caleb slammed the brakes. The truck skidded slightly, but he held control, pulling it onto the shoulder and jerking the door open before it had even come to a full stop. Bruno leapt out before him, sprinting toward the girl with military precision. Caleb's boots sank into the snow as he ran. The cold bit through his jeans and t-shirt, but he barely noticed. Each step was heavier than the last, not just from the snow, but from something clawing inside his chest. The girl didn't move. She didn't run or cry. She simply stood, arms stretched, finger trembling as it remained fixed on one spot in the lake. Bruno slowed his pace as he neared her, sniffing the air, then circling protectively around her. He let out another low growl, this time aimed at the lake. Caleb dropped to one knee in front of the child, hands held slightly out. "Hey there," he said softly, voice cracking with cold, and something else. "Are you hurt?" No answer. "Where's your mom? Your dad?" Still nothing. He looked her over. Frost had collected on her lashes, her shoes, one missing. Her lips were pale, but her eyes were the color of the lake behind her. Icy, unblinking, almost hollow. She turned her head slowly and looked at Caleb. Then her arm fell limply to her side. But Bruno didn't stop. He was already moving, toward the spot she had pointed at. With his front paws, he began scraping at the top layer of snow that had crusted over the ice. "Bruno, heel!" Caleb called, rising to his feet. But the dog didn't respond. That growl was back, deeper now, almost urgent. The wind picked up again, sharp and howling. Caleb felt his breath catch. A sudden memory, the mountain pass, the fire, the scream of metal and the taste of blood, flashed behind his eyes. He shook it off. Not now. He stepped toward Bruno, the girl still silent behind him. As he reached the dog, he saw it. Something beneath the ice. A ripple in the surface. Not a shape he could recognize, but it wasn't natural. His fingers trembled, not from cold. No, he whispered, more to himself than anyone. Behind him, the girl let out a sound, a sob, small and broken. Caleb turned, heart thudding. She dropped to her knees in the snow and cried, for the first time. Not a tantrum, not fear, a cry of grief, of knowing. He looked back down at the spot. He wasn't sure what he expected. A body? A memory? A ghost? But something in him shifted. He had planned to die that night. The revolver was still in the glove box, the letter on the table, unsigned. The past had eaten him slowly for 10 years, and tonight it would have taken the last bite. But now, this girl, this moment, this dog still clawing at the ice, he didn't know what to feel, except one thing. He couldn't leave. Not yet. He pulled out his phone, shaking fingers tapping the emergency number. "This is Caleb Mercer. I found a girl. She's alone. She needs help. And I think someone's under the ice." He didn't hear what the voice said next, because Bruno had started barking, loud and sharp, pacing frantically over the ice. And behind him, the girl stood once more, her eyes locked on Caleb. Still silent, still pointing, still waiting. The wind had eased only slightly by the time Caleb knelt on the lake, gripping his hatchet with both hands. The ice beneath him creaked under his weight, groaning like something alive and ancient. He could feel Bruno pacing behind him, the German shepherd's claws scratching into the snow as he circled the dark blur beneath the frozen surface. Maisie sat a short distance away on the bank, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her pink dress, now stiff with ice, clung to her small frame. She hadn't said a word since they found her, not even when Caleb crouched beside her and asked where she'd come from. Her silence was deeper than fear. It was sealed, like the lake itself. Caleb struck the ice. The first impact echoed like a gunshot through the trees. A sharp fracture raced across the surface, webbing outward in pale lines. He struck again, and a third time, until water began to seep through the cracks. The air stung his skin. Bruno stood close, ears up, tail low, watching intently. Finally, a portion of the ice gave way with a muffled crack. Caleb chipped carefully at the edge until he could reach inside. His glove met resistance. He pulled slowly, breath steaming in the cold, until something emerged. It was a scarf. Violet, soaked and half frozen, with a small embroidered star near one corner. A woman's scarf, not the sort a child would wear. He turned to Maisie. She was watching him, her eyes too large for her small, dirty face. He held the scarf up slowly. She blinked but didn't react. No nod, no shake of the head. But her body gave the answer. Her shoulders curled inward and her face twisted. For the first time, she looked like she might cry. Caleb folded the scarf and stuffed it into his coat pocket. Then he crossed the distance between them and knelt again. "We're going to get warm," he said. "You're coming with me." Maisie didn't resist when he lifted her. She was far too light, like something hollowed out. Caleb tucked her close to his chest and moved quickly toward the truck. Bruno followed, his gait tight and alert. Back at the cabin, Caleb stoked the fire until the room glowed with orange warmth. He laid Maisie on the couch and wrapped her in the thickest quilt he had, a heavy wool one that still smelled faintly of cedar. Bruno curled beside her, resting his head near her knees. Caleb watched the girl from across the room, unsure of his next move. The revolver was still in the glove box of his truck. The half-written letter still sat on the desk in his bedroom. None of this had been part of the plan. And yet here she was, silent and shivering under his roof. He poured hot water over a cocoa packet and stirred until it frothed. When he handed the mug to Maisie, she stared at it for a long time. Then, with trembling hands, she took it and held it to her lips. Caleb stepped back, slowly pulling the satellite phone from a drawer near the kitchen. There was no cell reception this far out, but the phone still had a direct link to the Ironvale Sheriff's office. A woman picked up. Her voice was brisk but not unkind. "Ironvale Sheriff's office. This is Hensley." "This is Caleb Mercer," he said. "I found a child near the lake, Pine Hollow. She's about 4 years old, alone, not speaking. I also found a scarf, possibly adult-sized, under the ice. There was a pause on the line. We've got a missing person alert that might be connected, Hensley said. Claire Nolan, age 28, single mother. Her vehicle was found overturned this morning near Ridgeback Trail. No sign of her or her daughter. She's here, Caleb said. The girl, but there's no sign of the woman. I'll head there now, Hensley replied. Less than an hour later, the growl of tires on snow signaled the arrival of a dark green county vehicle. A woman stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark uniform and heavy boots. She had a shaved head under her winter hat and deep brown skin that glistened slightly in the cold. Her name tag read Hensley. Deputy Marla Hensley looked to be in her mid-30s, with a focused, measured way of moving that suggested both experience and exhaustion. She had the calm demeanor of someone who had seen loss and chosen not to be consumed by it. "You Mercer?" she asked as she stepped onto the porch. Caleb nodded. "Inside." Hensley entered, her eyes scanning the cabin quickly. Her gaze softened slightly when it landed on Maisie. "She's not speaking," Caleb explained. "Barely moved. She seems to trust the dog more than me." "Good instincts," Hensley muttered as she knelt beside the couch. "Hey there, honey. I'm Marla. You're safe, all right? You're doing great." Maisie blinked but said nothing. Caleb handed over the scarf, found it under the ice. She pointed right to it. Hensley examined it with gloved fingers. This was in the report. Purple scarf, star at the corner, belonged to Claire Nolan. Her mother? Most likely, but no sign of the woman herself. We were afraid she might have gone through the ice. "She didn't," Caleb said. "At least, not there." Hensley straightened up. "The storm's not letting up. I'll file a temporary care order and come back first thing tomorrow. She should stay here tonight. That okay with you?" Caleb looked at Maisie again. She had fallen asleep with her hand on Bruno's back. He nodded slowly. "I'll manage." Hensley left a small emergency radio and a folder of temporary custody papers. As she pulled the door closed, she paused. "Whatever happened out there, you being here might have saved her life," she said. Caleb didn't answer. The weight in his chest was too familiar, but tonight it was just slightly different. Later, as the fire cracked and Bruno dozed, Caleb sat in the wooden armchair and stared at the sleeping child. His own eyes burned. He could feel the cold clawing at the windows, but for the first time in years, the inside felt held. He looked at the scarf, folded on the shelf, and he whispered, "One more day." The morning broke in shades of gray. Iron Vale's sky hung low and heavy, clouds like bruises pressing down on the snow-draped pines. Caleb stood on the porch with a steaming mug of black coffee, shoulders hunched against the wind. He hadn't slept much. Every time his eyes closed, the dreams came, half war, half winter, twisted memories stitched together by guilt. He glanced over his shoulder through the frosted window. Maisie was still asleep, curled beside Bruno on the couch, like a smaller version of the dog itself. She clung to the thick quilt in one of Bruno's ears, her expression unreadable. She hadn't spoken a single word since arriving. Caleb stepped down from the porch, boots crunching into the snow. The surface had crusted overnight into a brittle shell. He passed the truck, still coated in frost, and made his way back toward the lake. He needed answers, even if they didn't come easy. The surface of Pine Hollow was eerily quiet now. Yesterday's ice fracture had already crusted back over in a lacy sheen. Caleb squinted into the trees along the lake's edge. Snow covered most of the tracks from the storm, but something still remained, a shallow indentation leading toward the tree line. He stepped closer. There it was, a long groove in the snow, like something, or someone, had slid down the embankment. A few staggered boot prints followed, mostly filled with ice, but still visible if you knew how to read terrain. Caleb had been trained to track enemy movement through sand, rock, and jungle. Snow was no different. The weight pattern told him this wasn't a child. The stride length was long, heavy, unsteady. He followed the trail cautiously, ducking beneath low branches crusted with ice. The trees thickened as the land sloped downward. About 200 feet in, he stopped. There was a depression in the snow ahead, shallow but shaped unmistakably like a body had once lain there. His gut twisted. If someone had fallen here, why wasn't there more blood, more chaos? As he stood staring, a voice behind him made him flinch. "You following ghosts out here, Mercer?" Caleb turned quickly, his gloved hand moving instinctively toward his waist, where his service weapon used to be. A tall man approached from behind the trees, bundled in a heavy tan parka with a fur-lined hood. His name was Tom Baylor, and he was unmistakable even at a distance. Late 40s, about 6'2", built like an ex-lineman with broad shoulders and a neck that didn't seem to move independently. His thick beard was snow-dusted, and his breath steamed in the cold. Under the hood, his steel-gray eyes held both suspicion and amusement. Tom worked for Montana Search and Emergency Response, a volunteer unit that often beat official rescue services in backwoods emergencies. He was known in town for two things: finding lost hikers and finding trouble in bars after 2 beers. His attitude was blunt, and his sense of humor had a sharp edge. "I figured you'd come sniffing around this morning," Tom said, stopping beside Caleb and crouching to examine the snow. "You got a lead on the Nolan girl?" "I've got the kid," Caleb replied. "Maisie, found her near the ice." Tom's eyebrows lifted beneath his hood. "Well, damn. That's something. No word on the mother?" Caleb shook his head. "Nothing. But I found this spot. Looks like she fell or rested here. Then the tracks vanish into nothing." Tom studied the snow, squinting like a hunter. "You got a hell of an eye. Most wouldn't catch this." "She pointed me to it. The girl." Tom stood slowly, brushing off his knees. "Look, Mercer, I know you're trying to do right, but you've got history. The VA still sees you, don't they?" Caleb narrowed his eyes. "That has nothing to do with this." Tom shrugged. "I'm not judging. I'm saying you're in deep. Just don't let ghosts lead you off a cliff." Caleb didn't answer. He simply turned back toward the trees and began walking. The trail didn't go far. About 30 feet from the impression in the snow, Caleb found something that made his breath hitch. Caught on a low branch, frozen stiff, was a torn piece of blue nylon fabric, the kind used in women's hiking jackets. It fluttered slightly in the wind like a flag no one saluted. He took it gently, folded it, and slipped it into his coat pocket. Back at the cabin, Maisie was awake. She sat cross-legged on the rug, playing silently with a piece of firewood. Bruno lay beside her, watching with quiet vigilance. Caleb approached slowly and held out the scrap of jacket. Her eyes widened. She didn't speak, but she reached out, touched the nylon, and her lower lip quivered. Then, without a word, she crawled into Bruno's side and buried her face in his fur. That night, the dreams came harder. In the dream, Caleb was back in Kandahar. Only the desert was snow, and his squad mates were voices echoing through trees instead of alleyways. He heard the blast, the screaming, but when he turned, it wasn't the soldiers dying. It was a woman with blonde hair, her face obscured by frost, clutching a child. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat. The fire had died to embers. Outside, the wind howled like something mourning the world. Maisie slept near the hearth. Bruno curled protectively around her. Caleb stood and walked to the window. Snow was falling again. He whispered to himself, not sure if it was a prayer or a curse. "I will find her." The storm hadn't let up in 3 days. Snow buried fences, swallowed road signs, and erased any path back to normal life. But inside the Ironvale Sheriff's Department, the radio crackled to life just after noon. Deputy Marla Hensley adjusted the volume, expecting another weather warning. What came instead was a voice, gravelly and uncertain, coded in age. This is Walter Dyer. I live out off Timber Ridge, near Old Quarry Creek. Found someone, a woman. Hurt pretty bad. Been here a few days. I think she's not right in the head." Marla straightened, her brows knitting together. The name was unfamiliar, but the location wasn't. Timber Ridge was a rarely traveled area, a few miles from where Claire Nolan's SUV had been found overturned. Marla grabbed her coat and keys, called dispatch, and set out with the engine howling against the wind. Walter Dyer's cabin was barely visible under the snow. It sat nestled between dense pines, smoke curling weakly from the chimney. A narrow footpath had been carved through the drifts, likely by Walter himself. The man who greeted her at the door was in his late 60s, wiry but strong-boned, with a narrow face weathered by decades of outdoor labor. His beard was silver, unkempt but clean. His eyes, pale and watery, held an uneasy kindness. He wore a flannel shirt under a patched-up wool coat, and his hands were cracked from cold and age. Walter had lived alone for years. Locals remembered him as a once happy man, a woodworker who lost his wife to cancer 5 winters ago. After that, he'd withdrawn from town life completely. He refused phones, internet, even mail. Some thought he'd gone senile, others thought he preferred to disappear. "She came out of the woods 3 nights ago," he told Marla, leading her inside. "Wasn't walking straight, fell right in front of my porch, head bleeding. Didn't know her name. Still don't." The cabin was modest, its interior clean and quiet, lit only by the orange glow of the wood stove. A woman sat on a cot near the far wall, wrapped in a heavy quilt. Her face was pale but smooth, her blonde hair matted in places but recently brushed. She looked up as Marla entered, eyes flickering with uncertainty. Claire Nolan looked younger than her 28 years, but exhaustion had etched faint shadows under her eyes. Her skin was fair, freckled across the nose. A bruise bloomed on her temple, spreading down toward her cheekbone in dull purple. She blinked at Marla, then back down at the mug in her lap. "Claire?" Marla asked gently. The woman didn't answer. Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug, as if the name had meaning but floated just beyond her reach. "She's been like that," Walter said. "Doesn't know who she is. Talks in little bits, mostly at night. Says things like snow and eyes and little girl, but nothing that sticks." Marla knelt beside her, noting the tiny embroidered star at the corner of the quilt, a match to the scarf found under the ice. "Do you remember a girl, about 4 years old, blonde like you?" she asked. Claire looked up, her lips parted. Her voice was hoarse. "Eyes, blue, dog," she whispered. Marla's heart kicked once against her ribs. "Maisie," she said softly, "your daughter, she's alive, safe. She's been asking for you." Claire frowned, as if trying to picture the word. She rubbed her forehead. I remember a sound, a bark, then snow. I was trying to find something. I think I fell." Walter handed Marla a small canvas bag. That's all she had on her. No AD, no phone. Just this and what she was wearing. Inside the bag was a broken bracelet and a keychain shaped like a star. Marla nodded, more to herself than anyone. "We need to get her to a hospital, and then home." Walter stood silently, staring at the snow outside the window. "If I'd known sooner, I don't get the news up here." "You did good," Marla said. "You kept her alive." Walter nodded slowly. "Thought maybe God sent her here to see if I still knew how to help someone." That afternoon, Marla drove Claire to the Iron Vale Medical Center. She contacted Caleb on the way. At the cabin, Caleb was chopping firewood behind the house when the radio crackled with Marla's voice. "We found her! Claire Nolan. She's alive, but she doesn't remember much yet. We're bringing her in now." Inside the house, Maisie sat cross-legged beside Bruno, drawing lines into a dusty notebook Caleb had given her. She looked up as he entered, her eyes scanning his face. "She's alive," he said softly. Maisie didn't say anything, but after a moment, she pressed her small hand to Bruno's back and leaned her head against him. Then she closed her eyes and whispered one word. "Mommy." Caleb swallowed hard and looked away. That night, while Maisie slept soundly beside the fire, Caleb wrote something new in the blank space of his notebook. Day 1. Claire sat in the hospital room wrapped in layers of soft flannel. Sunlight filtered through frosted windows, casting long, pale lines across the linoleum floor. She blinked slowly, her breath fogging the air with each exhale. Despite the heating, her hands trembled, fingers twisting nervously in the hem of the hospital blanket. Her hair had been brushed, falling softly over her shoulders in pale, uneven waves. A bandage still clung to her left temple, just above the eye. She looked fragile, her skin porcelain pale against the sterile white of the room. Across from her stood a woman in her early 40s, sandy brown hair tied into a tight bun, thin-rimmed glasses perched at the edge of her nose. Dr. Ellen Harper, the hospital's trauma psychologist, was a calm, methodical presence. Her build was slender, tall, posture flawless, voice low and even, like someone who had trained themselves out of emotional sway. She leaned against the counter, pen in hand, observing Claire's face with the careful distance of someone used to walking through damaged memories. Do you know what day it is? She asked gently. Claire shook her head. Do you know your name? Silence. Claire's gaze drifted to the window. You said the words of blue eyes and dog yesterday, Ellen continued. Can you tell me more? Claire didn't answer, but her hands stilled. A flicker of something, recognition or fear, passed through her eyes. Her lips parted, as if on the verge of saying something, but the words didn't form. Down the hallway, Caleb stood by the nurse's station, arms crossed over his chest. He wore his usual green thermal shirt under a wool-lined jacket, boots still dusted with snow. His face, typically unreadable, now looked drawn, as if holding in more than he could process. Bruno lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, but eyes alert. Maisie was curled in a chair nearby, legs tucked beneath her, hugging the same ragged pink quilt from the cabin. She hadn't let go of it since leaving. Caleb watched her. In the last few days, something had shifted. She followed him with her eyes now. She accepted food when he handed it to her. She held Bruno's ear while she fell asleep. The silence between them wasn't so thick anymore. A nurse stepped out of the room, motioning gently. They're ready, she said. Inside, Dr. Harper nodded toward the door. Claire looked up as it opened. Maisie stepped in, small and hesitant, her tiny frame dwarfed by the doorway. She held Bruno's leash tightly. The dog led her gently forward, stopping just before the hospital bed. Caleb stayed by the wall, arms folded, silent. Claire's breath caught. Her eyes welled with tears, but she didn't speak. Maisie stared at her mother. Then slowly, carefully, she took a step closer. Her voice was soft, shaking. Mommy? The word hung in the air like the first drop before a thaw. Claire's face broke. Her hands flew to her mouth, and her shoulders shuddered. She didn't speak, but she cried. Long, silent tears that streaked her cheeks as if melting through the ice of her mind. Maisie reached forward and touched her hand. Claire whispered, I don't remember, but I know this. I know you. Bruno let out a quiet whine and leaned his head against Claire's knee. Outside the room, Caleb turned away, blinking rapidly. He found an empty hallway and leaned against the wall, letting out a long breath. For months, he had felt numb. But now, with a single word, the silence inside him began to shift. Later that evening, they were discharged. Claire was stable, but memory recovery would take time. The hospital arranged a temporary stay at a recovery cottage just down the road, a warm wooden house maintained for families in transition. Caleb helped carry Claire's bag while Maisie held his coat sleeve. The cottage smelled like cinnamon and cedar. Claire sat by the fireplace with a cup of chamomile tea, her face still pale but steadier. Maisie lay curled on the rug beside Bruno, her cheek resting on his back. Caleb stood in the kitchen, staring at the kettle without turning it on. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something he hadn't named in years. He was beginning to care. Later, as he stepped outside for air, the sky overhead was filled with stars. Snow gleamed under the moonlight. He pulled his coat tighter, feeling the crunch of frost underfoot. Behind him, Claire's voice floated through the half-open window. She trusts you, she said. Caleb turned, surprised to see her standing at the doorframe, wrapped in a blanket. Her eyes met his. I don't know what I'm supposed to be to her right now, she whispered, but I know you've been that person. I didn't do much, Caleb replied, voice rough. You stayed, she said simply. And for Caleb, that word hit harder than any explosion he'd ever lived through. The trees stood silent in the late afternoon light, their long shadows stretching across the crusted snow like black veins on porcelain. Caleb trudged through the underbrush near the lake's edge, a narrow path Bruno had insisted on taking earlier. The dog, now several steps ahead, moved with determination. His ears were perked, tail still, nose low to the ground. The cold bit at Caleb's face, but his thoughts burned warmer than ever. Claire had been sleeping when he left the cottage, her breathing steady, her face less pale than days before. Maisie had curled up next to her on the couch, one arm slung protectively over her mother's waist. It had been the first time Caleb had seen peace in that house. But now something stirred inside him. Bruno had barked earlier, short and sharp, when they passed the old logging trail. Then he stopped, sniffed the air, and bolted. That's when Caleb followed. Bruno came to a sudden halt at the base of a crooked birch tree, his paw scratched gently at the snow, not frantic, but precise. Caleb stepped closer, crouched, and brushed away a thin layer of snow. There, half buried in frost, lay a small plastic hair clip, lavender in color, shaped like a butterfly. The center was cracked, but the scent that rose from it was undeniable. Lavender. Faint, but lingering. The same scent that had hung in the air when Claire cried for the first time in the hospital. Caleb picked it up and turned it in his hand. It was warm from the sun and the bark behind it, not yet claimed by full winter. He turned to Bruno, who stood still, watching him. "Good boy," Caleb said under his breath, then pocketed the clip and began the slow walk back. Back at the cottage, Claire was in the kitchen boiling water for tea. Her hair had been combed back loosely, and she wore an oversized sweater Caleb had loaned her. Its sleeves rolled at the wrists. She looked healthier, more grounded, though her movements were still cautious, as if she was testing the strength of each step. Caleb stepped inside and shook the snow from his boots, and Bruno followed, tail wagging once. Claire looked up and smiled, her expression softening. "I was just thinking about you," she said. Caleb hesitated, then approached the counter. From his pocket, he pulled out the lavender clip and set it down gently beside her mug. Claire froze. She stared at the clip for a long second, and then something broke across her face. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. She brought it to her nose and inhaled deeply. "Lavender," she whispered. Caleb nodded. Bruno found it near the lake, under the birch line. Claire clutched the clip and slowly sank into the nearest chair. Her face contorted, not in confusion, but recognition. Her eyes filled with tears. She touched the bruise at her temple, as if it had just happened. "I remember," she said quietly. "I remember everything." Caleb sat across from her. Maisie peeked in from the living room, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Claire's voice was steadier now, fuller. "The car spun out. We hit the ditch by the ridge. I got Maisie out of the back seat and wrapped her in the blanket, but she kept crying, saying she was cold. I couldn't call for help. The phone, I think it was in my purse, lost in the crash." She looked down at the clip in her hand. "She dropped this, right near the lake. I carried her down there, trying to find open space or someone to see us. Then she slipped from my arms. She ran toward the edge, and I chased her. I remember falling. I remember the crack in the ice and the cold, and then the dog. I heard barking." She looked at Bruno. Her eyes widened. "It was you!" Bruno, still sitting near the fireplace, let out a soft whine, then padded over and rested his chin on her knee. Claire wept openly now. Maisie ran to her side, wrapping both arms around her waist. "I'm so sorry," Claire whispered. "I didn't mean to let go. I didn't mean to leave you." Maisie, silent at first, finally whispered back, "You came back." Caleb stood and turned away, giving them space. His chest ached, not from regret, but relief. Outside the cottage, snow began to fall again, but it was lighter now, gentler, as though winter had loosened its grip, even for just one evening. That night, Claire tucked Maisie into bed and kissed her forehead. Then she stepped out to the porch where Caleb sat on a wooden bench, nursing a chipped mug of instant coffee. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and sat beside him. "I remember everything," she said again. "I figured," Caleb replied. He didn't smile, but his tone was lighter than it had been in days. Claire looked out toward the treetops. "I think I blocked it out. Guilt, panic. It was easier to forget." He nodded. "Survival does strange things." There was silence between them for a moment, broken only by the occasional crack of settling wood inside the cabin. Claire turned to him. "You didn't have to stay, Caleb." He looked down into his mug. "Neither did you." She smiled faintly. "Maisie thinks you're her hero." Caleb chuckled softly. "She might be the one saving me." From the doorway, Bruno watched them, tail curled neatly around his paws. Snow clung to his fur, but he didn't move, content to keep vigil in the twilight. The town hall of Ironvale had never been this full in the middle of winter. Locals pressed into wooden pews in thick coats and wool scarves, boots tapping nervously on salted floors. The air inside was warmed by old radiators and an underlying buzz of anticipation. Framed portraits of past mayors lined the walls, and the large state flag hung behind a podium that looked too formal for a place where town meetings usually discussed plow routes and firewood permits. Caleb stood near the back, arms crossed, his green jacket still dusted with snow. He had considered skipping the ceremony altogether, but Marla had shown up at the cottage earlier and said, "It's not about you, it's about what you gave someone else." So he came. Beside him, Bruno sat patiently, tail curled around his paws, ears twitching with every distant cough or shifting boot. Maisie sat a few rows up, nestled between Claire and Deputy Hensley. She wore a clean blue sweater, hair brushed into two loose braids, her fingers holding a paper program with a star drawn on the front. Mayor Bennett took the stage. He was a stocky man in his early 60s, with a thick white mustache and a booming voice trained over years of county fairs and holiday parades. His dark overcoat barely fit over his round shoulders, and he adjusted the microphone with practiced clumsiness. "Iron Vale is a town of strong people," he began, "and this winter we were reminded just how strong quiet courage can be." Caleb exhaled through his nose, already shifting uncomfortably. Recognition was never something he'd asked for. "This man," the mayor continued, gesturing toward the back of the room, "didn't want headlines. He didn't want applause. But he did something most of us would hesitate to do. In the middle of a blizzard, with no orders, no backup, and no guarantee of outcome, he made a choice to follow a child's silence into the unknown. And because he did, a family was restored." Applause echoed through the hall. Caleb lowered his eyes. Bruno didn't move. "Mr. Caleb Mercer and his service dog, Bruno," the mayor's voice wavered with emotion, "reminded us that even in the harshest winter, there's still a path to spring." Caleb was called forward. He moved slowly, jaw tight, gaze steady, but distant. He accepted the plaque without speaking. His calloused hands dwarfed the engraved wood. He shook the mayor's hand with a firm grip and turned to the crowd briefly. Maisie smiled at him, and Bruno finally stood, walking proudly to Caleb's side. They left before the reception. Outside, snow fell in gentle sheets, coating Iron Vale in soft white. The truck was already warming. Bruno curled up in the back seat, and Caleb stood by the passenger door, waiting for Claire and Maisie. Claire emerged a few minutes later, bundled in a long wool coat over jeans and snow boots. Her cheeks were flushed from the heat inside, or maybe from something else. "That was brave," she said as she approached. "I didn't do it for the ceremony." "I know," she said. Maisie peeked out from behind her, one mittened hand clutching Caleb's coat. "They said your name into the microphone," she whispered. Caleb looked down at her and managed a smile. "Yeah, and now everyone knows I hate microphones." She giggled. Back at the cottage, the fireplace crackled. Claire poured cocoa into 3 mismatched mugs, while Caleb tossed another log onto the flame. Maisie sat on the rug with Bruno's head in her lap, quietly humming to herself. Later, after Maisie had gone to bed, Claire stood at the window, staring at the snow falling over the trees. "I remember everything now," she said softly. "The night it happened." Caleb looked up from his chair. "You don't have to—" "I want to," she interrupted gently. "I carried her through the storm after the car flipped. My phone was gone. I tried waving down someone from the road, but I was on the wrong side of the ridge. Then I saw the lake and thought, maybe it would lead me somewhere. I slipped near the edge, fell into a low ditch, hit my head. That's when it went blank." She turned toward him. Her eyes were clear. "When I woke up in that old man's cabin, I thought I'd dreamed everything. The snow, the silence, her voice." Her hand pressed to her chest. "But it wasn't a dream, and I didn't find her. You did." Caleb stood slowly. His voice was quiet. "It wasn't just me." She stepped closer. "No, but it was enough." There was silence for a long while, the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. Then Claire smiled, not wide or showy, just enough to reach her eyes. "You know," she said, "they're calling you something in town." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "The soldier who found spring in the snow." He chuckled. "Sounds like something off a greeting card." She moved to the fireplace and handed him a folded piece of paper. "Maisie drew it for you during the ceremony. She made me promise to give it to you before bed." Caleb unfolded it slowly. Crayon lines sprawled across the paper. 3 figures holding hands, one tall with a green coat, one small with braids, one medium with yellow hair and a purple scarf. And to the side, a brown and black dog, tail wagging. Caleb looked up. Claire was already sitting beside the fire, sipping her tea, eyes closed. He smiled. It was the first real one in a very long time. By the time the snow had started melting in patches, revealing brittle grass beneath the pines, the lake had frozen over in smoother layers. It wasn't the chaotic shards of early winter anymore. The surface gleamed like glass, solid, still, and patient. The trees around Pine Hollow wore their white coats loosely now, and the sky had lost some of its winter iron, softening to a pale blue. Caleb stood at the edge of the ice, hands buried in his coat pockets. The wind tugged gently at his sleeves, not in warning, but as if inviting him to breathe. A small lavender bundle rested in his palm, tied with twine. Next to it, the violet scarf, the same one he'd pulled from beneath the ice all those months ago, had been washed and folded, its embroidered star still faint but intact. He crouched, brushed snow from the frozen surface, and laid both objects down gently. Behind him, the soft crunch of boots announced Claire's approach. She wore a cream-colored wool coat and matching scarf, her hair tucked into a knitted beanie. Her cheeks were pink from the chill, but her smile was warm. "I thought we'd wait until next week," she said, voice light. Caleb looked back with a shrug. Felt right today. Maisie came bounding through the snow a few moments later, wrapped in her quilted red jacket, her boots 2 sizes too big, and trailing fresh tracks across the bank. She had grown in the past few months, not taller exactly, but brighter. Her eyes no longer darted for escape. Her steps were certain, her laughter louder. She carried a small jar of colored stones and a folded note in crayon that simply said, "Thank you." Bruno, older now, with a little more gray around the snout, trotted behind her, ears up, tail swaying gently. He no longer moved with a soldier's stiffness. He had softened into the rhythm of their lives, but his eyes remained alert, especially near the lake. Claire bent to help Maisie place the jar next to the lavender. Caleb watched in silence, only moving to put a hand on Bruno's neck when the dog sat beside him. "Every winter we'll come back," Claire said quietly, "just the 4 of us." Caleb didn't respond, not because he disagreed, but because for the first time he felt no need to say anything. The words had already been lived. They returned to the cabin together, the same one that once stood as a fortress between Caleb and the world. Now, it had been reshaped, the windows no longer boarded, the front porch rebuilt, the inside filled with small signs of domestic chaos. Blanket forts in the living room, boots left near the door, and the smell of warm cinnamon bread that Claire had begun baking on weekends. Inside, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, catching the dust motes in the air. Maisie ran to the back room to grab her sketchbook, shouting something about drawing a moose with wings, and Bruno followed her lazily, tail thumping the floor. Claire poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to Caleb. Her fingers brushed his, and she didn't pull away. "You've been sleeping better," she noted. Caleb nodded. "Still go to therapy on Tuesdays." She sat beside him at the small table, drawing her legs up onto the bench. "Do the dreams still come?" He stared into his mug, then said, "Sometimes. But now, they don't end in silence. Now, there's light." Claire smiled. "Maisie says you talk in your sleep. She say what I say? Mostly you say, 'Bruno, don't eat that.'" Caleb laughed, deep and genuine. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. Outside, the last of the snow from the trees began to fall in clumps, thudding against the soft ground. A single bird called from the woods, a sound Caleb hadn't heard in years, or maybe hadn't noticed. That night, as they got ready for bed, Caleb stood for a long time beside the fireplace. A photo sat on the mantel now, not of war or medals, but of a messy snowman. Maisie grinning beside it, Claire holding a thermos, and Bruno mid-sneeze. He stared at it, then looked to the bedroom where Maisie's gentle humming floated out through the door. He walked into his own room, changed into a faded gray shirt, and slid beneath the flannel covers. Bruno padded in a few minutes later and curled up on the rug by his feet, letting out a satisfied sigh. Caleb reached down and scratched behind his ears. "Stay," he whispered, just like always. And for the first time in over a decade, Caleb fell asleep before the fire died out. And didn't wake screaming. Sometimes, miracles don't come in thundering skies or shining lights. Sometimes, they come in the quiet bark of an old dog, in the small hand of a child reaching out, or in a heart that chooses to stay, even when it's easier to walk away. God doesn't always stop the storm, but he often sends someone to walk with us through it. And maybe, just maybe, you're someone's miracle too. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to let us know where you're watching from and who you're praying for. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love, faith, and second chances. And may God bless you, wherever you are, whatever storm you're facing.